some people. All right. Okay, team. Now that might be interesting. Looking through the list of names.
So there's a mini sort of.
Yes, there is. All right. Okay. And Ian, how are you?
Good.
All right, team. Now we're going to be getting ourselves underway. And one of the first things that we are going to, oh, Dane.
I think I saw her in the library during a meeting.
Oh,
She's here.
oh. Oh, honestly. It's all right. No worries, we wouldn't start without you. Right, now, what you will probably be useful to start off with is a pen and some paper. Virtual people too, that would be a good thing to have. Right, yes, you can do it in notebooks or you can do it on iPads if that would be preferable to you. There is plenty of paper at the back. Help yourselves. Need to review our model very quickly and to have the model with us so that we're going to be able to compare the model with the next competing philosophy that we look at. So what we need is we need an ADAS model, and we are going to need to have it as new classical, right, with a full employment long run aggregate supply curve. Your call. Put it where you like.
On the same one, right? Not on the four different
Ones. You can have quadrants, it's absolutely fine. Needs to be big enough for you to be able to see. So don't draw them microscopically. Needs to be dark enough for you to be able to tell what they are. Sorry?
This is random. That's why I never do. Yeah, and you can.
ADAS model. I want the philosophy for you to be thinking about with this one is the classical model. All right. The idea that you've got a long run aggregate supply curve in the model, you can put it where you like. It needs to be perfectly inelastic. It needs to be identifiable, and it needs to be where you are plotting it as the full employment output level. You can make them colorful, you can do all of that. Should that help? Start there. Right, now, once you've drawn that, drawing models. Right, now that you've got that, I want you to do some magic with it. Magic. And it doesn't matter where everything is in your model. All right. Here's what I want you to show on your model. Show, or if you like, illustrate and increase and aggregate demand. Using the model you've drawn. Now I'd like to see what happens when aggregate demand increases. Unless you want to do another one, you don't do another one. Now I want you to pay very close attention to what's happened as you have increased aggregate demand. What has happened to output? What has happened to the price level? Here's what I want you to do now. Magic trick continues. Two. Show. Illustrate. Another increase in 80. Happen now.
I have that sort of space.
And again, pay special attention to what's happening to output, employment, income, and price level. And magic trick continues. Go. Right. Another. Increase. And 80. Do be careful with your labeling. You'll probably want 81, 82, 83 sort of idea, or 80 dash, 80 dash dash, 80 dash dash dash. 80 star, 80 star star, 80 star star star. Very good. You do have to be really careful with your labeling, making sure you're getting it right. Paying special attention to what's happening with output, employment, and income. Okay. Need a few more seconds to do that. Right. And virtual people, I hope that yours is looking good. Again, making sure you're getting your labeling right. Curves, the axis. Good man. All right. Now, let's review the classical model. What does the classical model say is going to happen in the long run? What do you think?
There's only like so much output you can where it reaches the maximum output. So if you want to employ someone for their maximum output for a long period of time, pay them more.
In the long run, the economy should be moving automatically to full employment. Now, wherever your full employment line is on your models that you've drawn, that's where you're supposed to end up in the long run. So what you do now is have a look at your models and then trace a path basically over time. So you're going to go from 81 to 82, 83, but where is the intersection with LRAS and 82 or 83, depending on what you label it, right? So I want you to see an intersection between LRAS and AD. Where is the intersection? So you started here, right? And we went here, then we went here, then we went here. But if this is the long run, where do we end up? Good, that's 83. So you end up there. Oh, that's pretty colored. All right. That's okay. All right. So we started here. Right. First expansion, second expansion, third expansion, but when we reach the long run, we're there. So what has happened in the long run? Joel was absolutely right. The closer you are to full employment, in the long run, the more expensive those extra resources are going to become. So you keep pushing your foot on the accelerator in the economy. You keep pushing and you keep pushing and you keep pushing, and the costs are going to rise. Okay? Because there's only so many people, so many resources. So despite the fact that you're doing all of this expansion, what is the pretty much only thing you are expanding in the long run? What's the only thing that's gotten bigger in the long run? Price level. So all of that, yay, we've grown the economy. No, the only thing we've grown is the inflation level. That's it. All right. In the long run, all resources are variable, therefore a long run change in the price level won't actually change the long run aggregate supply curve. It is vertical at full employment, meaning that in the long run, the economy produces potential GDP independent of the price level. Doesn't matter how hard you push the economy, how much fiscal expansion you are doing, you always, according to classical theory, end up at full employment. So all of that effort only generates inflation. That's all. Now that has some pretty significant implications. You think about, again, the philosophies of all of the politicians. Let's put our foot on the accelerator. We need to be growing our economy. This is what we want. Well, according to classical theory, you do that, you're going to end up with inflation. Now, I sent you a link to an article talking about Janet Yellen. Yeah. When she was elected, the only thing that you heard from the Republican side was Yellen. And one of the things that she said is that in the next year, 2 years, the US economy could reach full employment. Well, if that happens, and remember the government in the US has just unveiled plans for, I think, either $3 or $4 trillion worth of infrastructure spending. So what are economists then going to worry about? Inflation. So you're going to start seeing a whole lot more blogs and news articles and people saying the US economy, there's going to be inflation, we need to worry about this, we need to be preparing for this. Yeah, maybe. According to classical theory, that's what will happen. Right? Closer we get to full employment in the long run, that's what happens. Now, why do you think there is a disagreement about aggregate supply? What do you think they're going to disagree about? Have a think about what we've said. Classical theory says the economy in the long run always returns to full employment. So you can see where the other argument might be. What are they going to disagree about? Long run aggregate supply curve. Perfectly inelastic for employment level. What possibly could they disagree about that? Absolutely on the right track, Fatima. Don't cheat and look it up, then you will. Exciting reveal. Exciting reveal. Good thoughts, good thoughts. Any other thoughts? It's like a TOK class all over again. You had a TOK day the other day, didn't you? Excellent. Sounds exciting. Andrew will have to come up with some extra special questions then. Yes. I was thinking you want a famous economist, and I was thinking you could One of my favourites, if he was a father or something, John Kenneth Galbraith. That was always quite funny when we were there, because which Galbraith do you read? Yeah. It's probably the one who get it first. He has an artist's eye, so he should be able to see the problem straight away. Right, give me about 30 more seconds to put a thought down. Don't look on Google, just a thought from you to what they might be disagreeing about. Yeah, John Kenneth Galbraith, he was the guy who talked, I'm trying to remember the phrase. He was the one who said there was a ludicrousness, an absurdity in the idea of having roads that weren't well maintained in a developed country. Right? He said that there was an absurdity of the market system. They have a very wealthy, very highly developed country and roads that weren't well maintained. He was an interesting chap, John Kenneth Galbraith. He was about 6'3". He was quite a big man. And he once famously was asked what books did he read before he went to sleep at night. And that's where he came out with the absolutely killer line, why my own, of course, because none of the others are worth reading. Right, that kind of a guy. All right. Still waiting on a couple others. All right, Hayden's got a good idea. Coming out. Ingrid's got 2 ideas. Cool. Yes, you're absolutely right, Fatima. Yep, that's where we're going. Yeah, Wing Hao, you're on the right path as well. First thing. All right, I'm not going to let you go on much longer, so if you haven't submitted, all right, good. Okay, here are the implications of the classical model. As price level increases or decreases, if real costs are constant, then a firm's profits are also going to be constant. They therefore will have no incentive to increase or decrease their output levels. If the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical at the potential level of GDP, then both recessionary and inflationary gaps are only able to occur in the short run. They're not sustainable. So therefore, how do you reach a long run equilibrium? How do you even get there? Now, most of us understand that recessions can actually last a while. They can. And it's something that worries economists at the moment. We've also seen that periods of inflation can last a while. If you're not familiar, there's a country you might have heard of, Japan. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a bit obscure. Yeah, I think they like sushi there. And very small cars. But in Japan, a number of years ago, they experienced something called deflation, which we're going to do a bit more work on. But it wasn't for a short period of time. In fact, deflation in Japan lasted for over 10 years. Now, according to classical theory, that shouldn't be possible. That should not be possible to have a short run that is that long. So when is the long run? When does it actually happen? Now, there's at least one learner who learned about John Maynard Keynes at the start of the course. And that learner will know John Maynard Keynes' famous quote about the long run. When did John Maynard Keynes say the long run occurred? In the long run, we're all dead. That's exactly what he said. He said we shouldn't be concerned with the long run at all, because we live in the short run. That's where we are. Each day is a new short run. So therefore, that's what our policies should be reflecting. Now, if you haven't figured it out yet, classical economics lasted all the way as the main school of economic thinking. This was it. Started basically with Adam Smith. And it lasted all the way until, well, essentially the end of the 1920s. More or less, end of the 1920s. Because what world phenomenon happened at the end of the 1920s? 1927, 1928, something happened. Rather large thing happened in the world. Well, yes, but before the Great Depression was the Great... Yes, the Roaring Twenties, yes, but before you could have a depression, you needed to have a recession. Well, the war was well before then. You needed to have a crash. So 27, 28 was the Great Crash. Then that led to the Great Depression. Now, as I said, at that time we were classical thinkers. What you put on the accelerator, what you put on the brake. What you put on the accelerator, what you put on the brake. Seemed to be the best thing to do. But also, if you leave the economy alone, in the long run, it'll magically make its way back to full employment. Oh, it's all right if you've got a job, but what if you're one of the thousands and thousands of people in the Great Depression who don't have a job? Then what? Yeah. Do you just wait for the economy to fix itself for you to get a job? Can you afford to do that? How long will that take? Economists were used to these things happening quite quickly. We'd seen it happen. Now, the Great Depression was lasting, and it had lasted over a year. Now it lasted over 2 years. And it's heading into its third year. The whole world is going, oh dear. Our entire philosophy is not working. Yeah, there's a phrase that you use TOK-wise when you change your philosophies. What's the phrase? Paradigm shift. Thank you. That one. And it happened. And all of a sudden, economists said, this can't be true. There's got to be another way. Yeah, which sounds like one of those weird movies where everybody just chants it another way. One division for the children, right? Yes. Yes.
The LOAS code,
Yes.
the straight line, is basically to represent potential GDP, like best.
Yes.
Okay, so it's also basically the constant line of business cycle.
Yes.
Anything but the straight line is real GDP.
Yes. And the business cycle, yes. That is actual GDP.
Okay, so if there is a gap between, so if it's not all equal, in the ADAS, and it's not all equal, and there's a gap, the gap represents how much but not at potential gap, right?
So we talk about it as being either inflationary or recessionary. So it's inflationary if we are beyond what was possible, but as we discover in classical economic thinking, that can't last. If it is below what is possible, then it's classified as recessionary. And again, according to classical economics, that won't last either, because the economy will move towards full employment.
And someone else said that thinking that long run is too long what we do, so all this will just occur in the short run.
Well, yeah, and it means that if it's classical thinking, it means you don't have a role for the government. Yeah, because the government doesn't need to bail out the economy, because it will fix itself. It will automatically move there. Yeah.
So inflationary gap technically will cause inflation.
Yes.
But that would the gap is when the requirement is at the lack of something like that.
Yes.
So wouldn't that and the application that just cause a shift in the lack of inflation? Since in classical you move
Yes.
then wouldn't that cause decreasing price level and also up and that recession instead of
Yes.
then why is it falling inflation?
So the gap itself exists. Then when you remove the gap, it disappears. And if you push it even further, then it will become a recessionary gap.
We're not moving the LRAS, we're moving.
You're just moving around the potential. Right? So it's either inflationary or it's recessionary.
But I thought inflationary gap means that it will cause future inflation.
Yes.
According to the what like law that they will cause recession.
Well, inflation is still occurring. Yeah, it just might be occurring by a smaller amount. Yeah. Okay. We need a subsection of the lesson which is Andrew time. Right. Right. So price level, output real GDP, aggregate demand. Oh, good. Yeah. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply in the short run. Now, if we're talking inflationary gaps, then we're talking YS is here and YE is there.
So yeah, so that going to automatically the AD will shift so that it's at the full.
Yes, in the long run.
Yeah, in long. Then
Yes.
the AD when the AD shifts that way, that will cause a decrease in price level. So that would be
Yes.
recession.
Okay, so the suggestion here is that that's the price level there at the current short run equilibrium. Yes, absolutely right. Okay, but for it to, in the long run, it will move there.
Yeah.
but it does that all by itself.
Yeah, that's, if you draw the line in the long run, right, you cross through the word like this.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. You're talking about the aggregate demand decreasing.
Yes, because you will move towards the full employment.
Yes.
Then they'll cause the price level.
Yes.
So isn't that recession? Yeah, and we draw that way to the y-axis. Yes. Yeah. So isn't that
This is still a positive level of growth, and this is still a positive level of pricing. It's just that the rate of change of price. See, we're getting a little bit terminologically confused, and I know why. It's because I talk about this as being inflation, right? When it's not, right? It's the price level, okay? Inflation, I didn't want to get to this, but we can, right? Inflation is the rate of change of prices, of the price level. So it's actually a percentage change. Right? So over time, right? So you can have a range of inflation, but if the prices are actually falling, but it's still classified as inflation. Right? But on the model that we use, we talk about inflation. We do. Right? It's not to say it's not inflation, it's just that we haven't used the strict maths needed to do a calculation of inflation, which we're going to, just not today. Yeah. Right. Now, therefore, graphically, under a classical model, we are going to see the price level rise in accordance with classical theory. As we increase output, we're going to end up back at the level of full employment. And the only thing that will have changed isn't output. The thing that will have changed is the price level. So again, all of that effort has led to the price level changing. You end up back there, remembering that as you are pushing outwards, you are increasing output. Increasing output increases the costs that you then need to pay for the resources that you have. That increasing prices is going to lead to your aggregate supply curve decreasing. As that happens, you end up under a classical assumption of increasing prices, or increasing the price level. And in the long run, you end up all the way back here. So the only thing that has changed is inflation. Now, again, what we're doing is we're making assumption on top of assumption on top of assumption. Yes, we are. And we also know that people don't necessarily, as we've discussed, behave rationally. We know that. Right? We also know that sometimes politicians aren't motivated purely by the good of society. We know that too. So there are a lot of ifs and buts with all of this. And that's the world of macroeconomics that you are now in. And that's why it's also fun, because it's always on this hand, this will happen. But on that hand, maybe it won't. Yeah? Right? There's a joke about the one-armed economist. Should I? Haven't said this one? Okay. So there was a king who employed an economist to give him economics advice. And he got very upset with him one day and cut off one of his arms. The reason why he cut off his arm was because he kept saying, well, on one hand, but on the... No! All right. So the implication is government doesn't need to be involved in the long run. The economy will work its way back to equilibrium in the long run. Okay, full employment. That any government involvement, that any aggregate expansion will only ever be inflationary in the long run. So therefore, when the economy was going through the Great Crash leading into the Great Depression, they were worried about inflation. That's what they were worried about. So rather than do what we now do in economics world, which is increase our fiscal expansion, okay, increase our aggregate demand, they decided it would be a good idea in the middle of a depression to decrease aggregate demand. Which you can imagine what happened. Yeah, they did decrease inflation. Yeah, they absolutely did. They also made the depression a whole mile times worse and dragged it out for at least another year, if not two, until the world saw that this philosophy wasn't working, that we needed a paradigm shift, and along came the second most famous economist, some might argue the first, John Maynard Keynes, who saved the world from the Great Depression. All right. Then, after World War II, because he was still alive at that point, he saved the world again, right, by helping to create the United Nations, all right, and the IMF, and I believe the WTO as well, but I may be wrong on that one. All right. He was so famous, his books became the textbook. Right? Whereas before it was all classical, then it became John Maynard Keynes. His word was law. And he got given a peerage in the UK, which meant he was a noble. So from then on out, he was known as Lord Keynes. And he was allowed legally to vote in the British Parliament. During the Depression. Yes. But they thought they were doing the right thing according to theory. Turns out they really weren't. The implication, as said, is that neoclassical theory aggregate demand changes are only ever, in the long run, inflationary. That's a monumental implication of this. So when you do talk to economists, and some of them will tell you what their philosophy is, they start telling you they're a classical economist or a neoclassical economist, but there are still some out there, right? You know what they're basing their beliefs on. You can still online look up neoclassical economic academic journals. Right? But they still exist. Changes in aggregate demand can only influence real GDP in the short run. So, but a sad state of affairs. So therefore, along comes John Maynard Keynes. There he is. Doesn't appear to be a particularly imposing gentleman. Oh, the one on this one's not him. That's not him. No, that's on next. That one's a very famous economics meme. That one. It was so profound a change. It was such a paradigm shift. That year we did talk about it as a revolution. It is so profound that it is a separate bullet point in your syllabus, making a comparison between classical economic thinking and Keynesian economic thinking. So what does it mean? This one. All right. What if all resources aren't flexible in the long run? What on earth made us make that assumption that they were? Yeah. When AD increases, wages will rise, but in a recession, do they actually fall? Right? What if the resources can't respond? You know, we talk about full employment. We talk about resources being flexible, resources being able to move from one place to... How do they move from one place to another? Can we get that one right? Classical economists? How are you going to get labour from one part of the world to another? How are you going to get labour from one part of the country to another? Remember, Adam Smith was writing in 1776, same time the American Constitution was being written, where very few people were actually able to read. Productivity levels were probably very low. There's some random Scottish philosopher telling them about short runs and long runs. Keynes said, no, that doesn't happen in real life. You know? I mean, would you be happy with a wage decrease? I know, yes, full disclosure, yes, I did accept a wage decrease myself. Yes, I have. All right? For the good of the company. Yeah, I did. It did take me a couple of years to get my wage back up to the level it was at before then. But, you know, we had a real life case study of that in New Zealand where the airline maintenance company said to its employees, you need to sign a new contract and we need you to cut your salary. If you don't cut your salary, then we're going to have to close the whole thing down because you're too expensive. So they were faced with a decision. Their decision was have a cut in wages or lose their job. What do you think they chose to do? Hands up, all of those of you who think that they chose to cut their wages. Sounds like the rational thing to do. They chose to lose their jobs. We're not having a wage cut. Business went under, gone. Outsourced to a cheaper country. Wages aren't flexible. They're really not. If you're ever tempted to think wages are flexible, try asking somebody if they'd like to have a wage cut. How happy would they be? So what Keynes said was there's an asymmetry, an imbalance between wages increasing and wages decreasing. That wages tend to only ever go up, even in cases of recession, like we're in at the moment. What you will find is that businesses won't decrease the wages of their staff. What would they do instead? What do they do instead? Fire them. Absolutely right. Because they get to save the whole cost at that point. And hopefully their business. But if they were to go to the staff and say, will you accept a wage cut? The staff are probably going to say no. Because self-interest shouldn't it rule, shouldn't it? We should be self-interested. Adam Smith said we were. So we should be fighting to hold on to our wages. Well, you hold on to your wages, it means Joel loses his job. Yeah, well, I don't like Joel very much. So. Yeah? Is that how it works? Happens. Absolutely happens. Right. Okay, so here's the implication from there. Keynes then went on to say, wages and product prices do not fall easily. So even the product prices, and you've seen this, you've gone to the supermarket, well, I don't know, maybe you don't, maybe you have butlers who do that for you, I don't know. Maybe you do the grab thing. Shoppy, order me some groceries. Yeah? You will have noticed the price hasn't gone down. Of nothing, of anything. In fact, the Malaysian government had to basically command the petrol prices down. Otherwise, they would have gone up a lot quicker than they have done. They don't go down. So Keynes is saying, therefore, that you could actually get stuck in the short run. And this was the whole argument that the classical economists were saying, is that in the long run you're going to return to full employment. Well, you might not. You might get stuck as an economy in a recession. It is entirely possible to never get out of a recession, according to Keynesian economics. What do you do then? It's like Groundhog Day all over again. You don't know the reference? Do you know that one? Russian doll? No, that might be a bit adult for you, that one. Happy Death Day to you. Some of you might know that one. The idea of a day that keeps repeating itself again and again and again. No matter what you do, the day never changes. I know you're sitting here at Nexus going, well, hey, you've got a TOK day next week. That'll be different. Woohoo! A day we get to sit and think about deep thoughts. How much deeper thought is there that this conflicting philosophy said you could get stuck in a recession? What if I sounded like you for a second. What if Groundhog Day is quite funny. I'm trying to remember if there's much adult content in it. I can't do it. He's a reporter and he gets stuck doing the same day again and again, and he doesn't know why. And it's basically the worst day of his life. Right? And so he tries to figure out ways to get out of it, and they become increasingly surreal. And each time he wakes up in the same day again. And eventually he figures out how to get the day to move on again. They don't ever explain why. That's kind of not the point of the movie. But it was quite funny. The Russian doll one is a modern telling of that same story. And the language is really horrific there, by the way. So don't be advised, adult content. Yeah? But she gets stuck in the same day. And then she finds out somebody else is also stuck in the same day. And then it turns out that the two of them, because they're stuck in the same day, right, it's like that sort of relationship between the two of them, that they have to work out what's going on in each other's day in order to solve both their problems. And there is some very comical parts to it. She keeps dying going down the stairs, which is very funny, right? She'll come out of the apartment and then trip down the stairs. And then the next time she'll come out and go, right, okay, I'm not going to fall this time. And then she'll try and go down the side of the wall. And then somebody will call to her and she'll turn that way and then fall backwards. It's just very surreal sort of humor. And so she decides not to go down the stairs. So she climbs out the window down the fire escape. And then she misses the bottom step of the fire escape. And then she climbs all the way down, gets off the fire escape, walks down the road, and there's an open drain. And she goes into the drain. It's those sorts of, I find them quite funny. Yeah? But you can get stuck in a recession, and we don't want that. Well, look at that! That is a Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve. Check it out. What's going on here? Well, the suggestion is that down here is where you have spare capacity. Over here is where you have zero, tell it right, spare capacity. So therefore, from a political point of view, from a policy standpoint point of view, it's going to have some quite significant implications for you. Because depending on where your economy starts, you're either going to be able to have huge impact on your economy through economic expansion and growth, or the only thing you're going to be able to do for your economy is cause inflation. But he said both cases are possible. So in Keynesian economics, there is a role for the government. And as I said to you, he saved the world. Because of the Great Depression, if it had gone on much longer, my word, we'd be in trouble. So instead, he simply pointed out that because of the Great Depression, we were down here. So to get to here again, we need to increase government spending. We need to increase aggregate demand. There's a role for the government here. And everybody said, all right, let's try that. And they did, and it worked. All right, it did help. It did help that something else occurred in 1939. All right? Tiny little Austrian man with a little wee moustache started causing some trouble. All right? One day he got in a little fight and he had to move in with his auntie and uncle in Balliet. No, that's a different story. The Fresh Prince of Austria. No. Sounds like a movie only Taiki Waititi would do. All right. So, spare capacity, zero spare capacity. You can right away see a very clear difference between classical economics and Keynesian. And the policy implications are going to be huge. So this is why the examiners love it. You can see why they love it. Because if you're talking government expansion here, it's going to work. If it's government expansion here, it's going to cause inflation. But under classical thinking, nothing. It's not going to work. It will only lead to inflation. Here, this we now see as being much more real. Of course, that worked really well. After the Second World War, had another bit of a problem. As you can understand, there was a whole lot of countries in certain parts of the world that had been absolutely knocked by the war. But there was at least one that had two major cities completely destroyed, right, irradiated for a while. Yeah. Well, Keynes' solution works there really well. Spend money. Do it. By the way, that country was Japan. End of the Second World War, in case you were unaware, Japan wasn't doing so well. In fact, it was kind of back to the Stone Age. Right? Its entire economy was in rubble. Which it works fine if you're a Flintstone, but not if you're Japanese.
For the last time, no.
All right, so then the Japanese said, well, we need to spend money. All right, so they did. Lots and lots and lots of money. They also saved lots and lots and lots of money. And then they used that saving to spend on lots and lots of money, on lots of things. So between 1945 and 1985, so that's a span of 40 years, Japan went from being one of the worst economies in the world to being the second largest in the space of 40 years. It was such a dramatic turnaround that it was known in economic circles as the Japanese economic miracle. Countries should not be able to do that. Go from 0 to 100 in the space of 40 years. Shouldn't be able to happen, but it did. Japan did it. And as a result of it, everybody looked at Japan and said, hey, 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 we like that. Let's do that too. So they did. So if ever you're walking around and wondering why all of these businesses have mission statements and vision statements and company songs and flags everywhere and motivational posters in the factories, and if you're wondering where all of that came from, Japan. Right? Because that's what they did. And it worked incredibly well. You know? Keynes saved the world then. Yeah, I don't know that many people get why, as such as they understand that this here suggests that there is a lot of spare capacity. So, in a sense, if you're talking the PPC curve, you're there.
That's why price level is not anything.
That's why you're able to do a whole lot of expansion.
But why would it be like same price level, and all of a sudden when you get output, it just goes right up?
Yes.
But why?
But why?
Yeah.
Because as soon as you start decreasing the level of capacity that you have, so you start using up resources,
Yeah.
all right,
Okay, I see.
they become expensive.
Okay.
But when there's a lot of them around, they're not expensive.
Right, and then the movement this way increases the spare capacity. And then
Yes. All right. Now that sounds much more realistic, much more reasonable, and politicians loved it. So that is why you can, to this day, I believe, buy a T-shirt that says "We're all Keynesians now." All right, because yeah, you will have found politicians actually telling people that their economic philosophy was Keynesian. Now that's pretty remarkable. Remember, this is a guy, it's like the 30s and 40s. That's a long time ago now. That's 90 years ago. Yeah? Now, we didn't always agree with our friend Lord Keynes, and we're going to find out that there is another philosophy that came along in the 1970s when this philosophy didn't work. And that was a paradigm shift. And then we're going to find out that the new philosophy, it didn't work. So we went back to Keynesian philosophy. Then we're going to find out that another period of time in history, Keynesian philosophy, yeah? And this has been the way it has happened now. The cycles do seem to be getting shorter and shorter. Okay, we are now in a global recession on the basis of the global pandemic. So everybody is Keynesian again, in a big way. Right? Probably the biggest Keynesian expansion that there's ever been. Right? But this is the point of the story about, you know, the world is on fire and you don't charge people for the buckets of water to put it out. You just do it. So that's exactly what's happening now. We do seem to have learnt, most of us, some lessons from the 1930s. You don't cut government spending, you increase it, and that does seem to be what's happening all around the world. There's only 1 or 2 countries that have gone backwards with that and threatened their expansion. But then Janet Yellen says America will be right back in another year or 2, full employment. So the implication then is use up that spare capacity, maybe it's inflationary after that point. All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to finish there for the day. I need to go down to do duty somewhere down there. All right, thank you very much.